Recording now, and we'll start the presentation in a minute. Okay, so welcome. We've got a small group, and I know that there are going to be some people joining at points during the day. So hopefully you can see my screen at the moment. We're on the front page of the module site. So as stated yesterday, the session from yesterday on reviewing the literature is there as a YouTube clip. The session regarding research design, again, is there, the first introductory session, and that has a lot of information about the assignment and the module. So it's there for you to listen to at your leisure. Okay, but this morning we are going to talk about writing a research proposal. There are two documents that I've got on the module site. We're going to work our way through this research proposal presentation, and then we're going to have a look at this supplementary piece of information second. So we'll start off with looking at the research proposal. Okay. So writing a research proposal, there are many different reasons why you might, why you might have to write a research proposal. This presentation is very much about a generic research proposal that you might have to do. And this is what I want you to do for your assignment. Now, obviously, when you are developing research proposals for different methods and different reasons, they will have a different focus. For example, if you are developing a research proposal that you are going to submit for funding, there is going to be a slightly different focus than it would be for this research proposal, which is for an academic purpose. Equally, when you have to resubmit this research proposal for your individual ethics committees and the University Ethics Committee, again, there will be slight amendments to this, only slight amendments for the university process, but certainly if you have to go through IRAS or your own local research and development committees, you will have to amend and alter and slightly adapt your research proposal. So depending on the purpose of the research proposal will slightly depend on some of the subtle changes you might have to make. At the moment, all of you are hopefully developing and thinking about that research question that we were talking about yesterday. And so we're looking at a specific research process. All of you, without exception, have to go through the university process because this is for an academic award. Most of you will have to go through some sort of other supplementary ethics approval, whether that is your local R&D or a full IRAS. So you will all have to do slightly different processes, and that's where it's so important that you identify a supervisor, and that supervisor can guide you through that process for ethical clearance. But for this particular assignment, I want you to write a research proposal for an academic purpose. So you've not got that financial or whatever emphasis. So the start of any research proposal obviously has a title. It's really an important aspect of your development, and it's probably the last thing you do. So a short, succinct keywords need to be brought into your research proposal. And then it might be where you think about what the remit is. So for this, as I said, for this purpose, it's an academic assessment, so it's a pure title is all I want. If you were submitting it for another source, you would have to think about the title. And you are going to think about whether it has a multidisciplinary, an international or a national priorities. So again, this is where if you are submitting it to another site, i.e. your ethics for R&D, you might have to adapt your title slightly to suit your local or national priorities. The next section will be a brief introduction. This is your introduction to your particular proposal. So a brief bit of background. You might call it background. It's up to you which one you want to use as, in terms of your subheadings. And this is where you've got to allow for why the rationale for your selection. It might be a work-related rationale. I know some of you are thinking of doing a work-related or a practice-related project that has some implications for your own personal workplace or your own personal or professional development, and that's where you're going to set the scene. You've got to think about your current professional issues, the local, the national, NICE, so on, Department of Health, and why this particular research question has come to the forefront of your mind. We then go into the literature section, and this is, as I said yesterday, a very important part of the research proposal. In your academic research proposal, this is where you are going to be outlining your literature review, and you have 20 marks for this section. So I don't want you to spend an enormous amount of time on the actual writing of it. Unfortunately, before you can write that small section, you have to have done an awful lot of work. And I don't downplay that. Although there's a very small mark allocation on this bit will take you a lot of time. And some of you are at different stages of this process. And we talked, I'm going to skip through this section a little bit quickly because obviously we talked about a lot about this yesterday with the literature review, but this is where you're setting the initial foundations of your project with your literature survey, your search, your review. We talked about finding, sorting, managing, digesting research material yesterday. We talked about writing the review and developing a critical analysis. Why is it so important to get the research? Oh, sorry, Sarah, you can't hear me at all, or is my it's my volume that's bad, is it? Okay, sorry, I've got both my volumes set to maximum, so I'll try and speak clearly and hopefully you'll continue to be able to hear me. Okay, so the literature review, why is it so important? As I said before, it cannot be overemphasized because it justifies your project. It puts it in the context of the research that already exists. And it provides a starting point. And so it is incredibly important for you to clearly articulate why it is that your particular research topic, because at this point all you've done is outline your topic and your background, is so important. It's so significant at this particular point in time. Projects that what we call we talk about the stability of a piece of research, and a project that is unstable is that it is based on a poor quality literature review. If it isn't going to stand up in the arena of research that's already existing, then it is going to be a weak research proposal, and it is very difficult to justify its academic worth then. And this is an academic research proposal, so this is the very important part of your project proposal. And as it says there, it shows the project is worth doing. It identifies exactly where you are in the research and the area of investigation being meaningful and recognised. And you're not just repeating existing work. You're not reinventing the wheel. What we say in a literature review, and you clearly identify for academic purposes where it is where the level of your research literature review is. It should be identified to how your project will fit within the existing body of knowledge. So what we say is at BSc level, you should be looking at working within the boundaries. So a BSc project might repeat a very similar study, but in a different setting, something along those lines. At master's level, you're very much concerned with potential developments. So it must identify where you are going to advance knowledge, advance practice, advance education. There must be looking at working outside the boundaries of what's already been published. Obviously, when you all, I hope, go on to do some doctorate or PhD work, that's really where you're completely outside the boundaries and you're advancing knowledge independently of something that's already been done. So it's very clear from your particular level that where you are sitting in this particular process. So I expect your literature review to very much look at those potential developments and potential contributions to knowledge. What's this research proposal going to do to promote knowledge and advancement? And so this is a rather, I think I better change the colour scheme here because it's an unpleasant colour scheme, really. As I've said, here we've got the current body of knowledge. Our undergraduate project, our BSc project very much sits within the middle of it. Our postgraduate, our MSc project has got to sit here on the edge. Great if you take it over the edge and you've come up with some really new and innovative ideas. That's going to make a huge difference to practice, then that is going to be fantastic. And certainly if you can take it forward to recommendations for further projects, further developments. Talking yesterday after a session, some of you have come up with some excellent research ideas, some excellent thoughts for your research proposals, and they are very much looking to lead into a larger study or a larger project that might be either national or take an innovation forward. So where you are looking for your project, you're very much sitting within this boundary of what's known about the subject. So allow some time, start as soon as you can. I know a lot of you already have. Take notes as you go along, keep that full bibliographic detail and summary. That's going to be really important for your development, and focus. Focus on what you exactly need to find out about and what you need to select. So just some general points for presentation purposes. This is always in the third person, so always in the passive tense. This isn't I am going to do this, I am going to do something else. There's no we. You're talking about it in the third person. Avoid abbreviations and jargon. We want excellent English, not just plain English. We want excellent English, and we want perfect spelling and grammar. And just some little tips that have come out from starting your research proposals. I'm not sure the third one down, reference correctly from the start. Referencing is a skill, as we're all very much aware. If we get it right from the outset, we use the Harvard referencing system. Cite It Right is available online through the university library, so you have no problem accessing the appropriate referencing system. And I don't know if any of you use EndNote, which is a referencing and cataloguing piece of software. The university has a license for it. You can download one version of it free online, and if you want to buy a full and extensive version, you can do it through the university, and it's considerably cheaper than the market value, and it's incredibly useful. I can't emphasize enough how fantastic EndNote is if you are writing, and certainly those of you, and in fact all of you who are going on to do your dissertations next year, if you start a referencing catalogue now through EndNote, you will never have to type up another reference list in your life. And I'm sure those of you who have done it in the past, how time consuming it is and how difficult it is to get it perfect. If you use EndNote, it's done for you, and I cannot, I know I'm not on any kind of marketing bung here. I don't get any money, but I use it, and I've used it for a while now, but I'm using it in my doctorate, and it is absolutely invaluable. So I can't emphasize enough how useful it can be. Any of you using EndNote yet, or have used EndNote? Hello? No. Helen, I completely, I can't suggest it enough. You'd be, if you can, do. And the other thing is that Julie Moody, who's our subject librarian, is very happy to offer you tutorials. And if you want me to organise one for you, either as an online thing or i.e. a webinar, or whether you want to contact her direct to make an appointment, she's very happy to talk you through the process. Because although it's quite intuitive, actually having some tuition on it is pretty invaluable. So if you do want to use it, just get in touch. I'm sure all of you in your different fields have got a leading name. I will, thank you, Sarah. Yes, I'll speak to Julie today and see if she can do a webinar for you, and I'll load it. It'll probably be a pre-recorded one, but I don't know whether she'll be able to do it live, but I'll see what she can do. There are some significant people in certain fields. When you're looking at, for example, a particular nursing issue, there might be a key name, a recognised leader, or an original theorist. If you're talking about decision making, for example, you can't talk about decision making in nursing without talking about people like Benner or Carper or other incredibly key theorists. It is absolutely essential to get those into your literature review, because they suggest that you have read the key people across your particular literature field. So just to recap, your literature survey, it needs to have two main components, as we talked about in more detail yesterday. That's search and review, and then there will be the need to refine and consolidate your literature review throughout the process. And when you come to use and build on this literature review for your actual dissertation chapter in your project, you'll have to revisit it and refine it again. But in terms of your research proposal, it might need some refining and consolidating. Now we get on to sort of the meat and bones of the actual research proposal section. And then we start that with an aim and then objectives. I mentioned yesterday when we were doing the overview of research that depending on the approach that you are going to take to your research proposal will depend on how this is worded. So those of you who are going to come from a qualitative perspective will have a qualitative aim, and those that are coming from a quantitative perspective will have a quantitative aim. That aim needs to be the broad purpose of the research. So an overview, not too long, it can't be too wordy, but it needs to explain exactly what you're going to do. So I don't know if you remember me saying yesterday, but it's that key phrase, what do I want to find out? What am I investigating here? What is the absolute aim of this research project? And be very, very clear, because we then break it down into smaller, concrete, achievable, measurable goals in our objectives. And it is our aim to have 3-ish, I don't mind if there's 2, I don't mind if there's 4, 5 gets a little bit complicated. So we're looking for around 3 to 4 clearly worded, obvious objectives that are achievable and match with the philosophy of the project itself. It's one slide in this presentation, but I can't emphasize enough how important this bit is, because once this bit is right, the rest sort of follows on, and it follows a path. We will spend a lot of time on Tuesday, for those of you who are coming, and when it comes to tutorial, if you can't come on Tuesday, we will spend all morning ensuring that our aims and objectives are right. So between now and Tuesday, if you're coming on Tuesday, or now when we're going to meet, I want this to be the bit that you focus on, because it is the bit that is so important. I can't emphasize it enough, because if it's right, then the project stands up. And what the kind of things that I'm looking for are, can I find that out? And am I clear about who I'm going to ask and how I'm going to ask them, so that those objectives are clearly stated and clearly achievable? So if your project is going to be around managing an education intervention and evaluating how that education intervention has improved stress in A&E departments, which I think is the focus of your study, Helen, as one example. Your objectives need to be focused on exactly what you want to find out. So if you want to find out whether what you have done for a group of people in a specific education, specific clinical environment has been successful, then those objectives need to be clearly outlined. So who am I going to ask? A&E department. How am I going to ask them? Through an interview, through a questionnaire, through observation? How am I going to find out the answer to the question that I'm asking? How am I going to undertake that process? And what are my philosophical underpinnings? So what perspective am I coming from when I'm trying to ask this group of people this question? So it's about getting it very, very clear in your head what you want to know and how you're going to find it out and who you're going to ask. Any questions at that point? You can either type or put your hand up, I don't mind which. Any questions? Okay, great. So we've written our research aim and we've written our research objectives, and we've clearly stated what we want to find out, who we're going to ask and how we're going to ask them. We then get on to the methodology section. And this is where the approach that's going to be taken to answer the research question or statement needs to be outlined. And you need to show off, for want of a better expression, your research knowledge. It isn't really enough at this stage to just say you're going to be qualitative. You need to have a larger philosophical underpinning than purely you've come from an interpretive perspective. And this is where it's clear, it's essential that you understand the principles of ontology and epistemology that we talked about yesterday, and that you can actually articulate with supporting evidence what yours are. So this research study will take a interpretative phenomenological approach, for example. And this will be demonstrated in this way with this method of data collection. So what is your view of the world? What stance will you take as a researcher? And now I don't know how many of you have got a clear idea of what your ontology and epistemology are personally, and what you want, how you want to take this project, and what you want to base this project on in terms of your philosophy. Any particular ideas, any particular thoughts coming through about what particular stance you want to take? Any ideas? I know some of you have got the idea of whether you want to be broadly qualitative or quantitative, whether you want to employ mixed methods. But in more detail in terms of your ontology and epistemology, have any of you got any thoughts about where or what perspective you think you're going to be embarking on? Silence in the ether I have at the moment. So in terms of your ontology, Sarah, where do you want to position yourself in terms of your research, do you think? Shall I open your mic? Hi, Sarah.
Yeah, 100% sure yet. I'm thinking of, I want to look at antibiotic resistance is my kind of topic, but I've narrowed it down to want to look at the expectations of patients who come and see a clinician with a respiratory tract infection, because that's a lot of what I'm doing at the minute, and a lot of patients seem to be coming in expecting antibiotics.
Right.
So I wanted to look at the expectation and where that came from, and how we change that going forward, really.
Okay.
So that's kind of where I am. I know I need to narrow it slightly.
Yeah.
So I suppose really I want to look from the outside, because some of the information is going to be stuff that's happened in history, the way we used to prescribe, etc., etc.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But my question to you would be, if I want to find out somebody's expectations, what's the best way of asking them what their expectations are?
Well, I was thinking of, well, either you've got questionnaires or interviews, really. I think questionnaires are going to be easier than interviews.
Yeah.
Because also thinking about it ethically, I don't know when the best time to do it is. I don't want to give somebody a questionnaire when they actually come for that appointment.
Right.
I don't think that would be the right time for them to answer it, because their treatment of that in that appointment could sway their answers at that time.
Yes.
If they've expected antibiotics and got them, they're going to be feeling better about it, and they might write a very good questionnaire, whereas if they didn't get them, it might alter what they write. Yeah.
So you've got a number of considerations to think about when you think about your aims and objectives, and this is where I go back to that question about, once we've got that bit right, the next bit follows, because if you want to find out what their expectations are, the best way to find out about somebody's expectations would be to physically ask them, wouldn't it? What are your expectations in this section? But your ethical barriers here are going to prevent you going, oh, what have you come here for and what do you expect? So there might be a retrospective aspect to it. So you might want to do a case study analysis. You might want to do some sort of audit of notes and prescribing inventory, and then follow that up with some sort of method of data collection where you've asked them, you went in, you got an antibiotic. What was that? Is that what you were expecting? Or you've come in, you haven't got an antibiotic, and was that what you were expecting? So that's two different pieces of research, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's what it's been. I know I've still got to narrow it down a bit more, but I'm just,
So
that's as far as I narrowed it by yesterday.
yeah, no, and that's fair enough. But what I'm thinking of in terms of your progression forward, you have to think about what you want to, firstly, what do you want to find out and who are you going to ask? Now, my only sort of personal reservation is remember that if you're going to ask patients anything about their treatment interventions, you're going to have to go through a full IRAS application. And
Okay.
that's time consuming and
Okay.
difficult. Because if you want to ask patients about their treatment options, you will have to go through that full process. So is there any way that you could adapt and manage your research aims and objectives for this to change the question that you're asking and who you're asking?
Or if I just ask general public,
Well, that's
as
even worse.
opposed to...
That's even worse. Asking the general public anything, because well, how would you sample the general public? And they're notoriously difficult to talk to.
Yeah.
Because there isn't an atypical person, is there? There isn't a Joe Blogs that you can go to and go, yeah, I'm going to get, if I ask X person, I will get the right answer. So Joe Public is a very difficult person to research.
It is, but Joe Public is our patient. So you can never predict.
Yeah.
I said it is, but Joe Public is also our patient. So it's exactly that I need to cover all those bases.
You do. So what's the research that's been done at the moment? What's been done about expectations of antibiotic prescription? Or has there been anything? Are there any statistics that have been...
Yeah, I've had a quick look. There's a few things that have been done, but not not very in depth.
No.
A couple of questionnaires and surveys and general discussions about behaviour of patients.
Right. Because my first question, I suppose, would be: have there been any national or local statistics published that present the antibiotic prescription rates to certain populations?
Okay, well, my initial thought actually was a paper that was published last month stating the prescribing rates are higher in coastal areas.
Right.
And that actually, that caught my interest, obviously, because we are a coastal area. And I wondered why.
Yeah.
And whether it's to do with age in coastal areas or not. So I wonder if maybe I should go that way.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. But also, if you're asking why people make prescriptions, do you have to ask the patients why they do it, or could you ask the practitioners why they have done it?
No, there's been a lot of work done on that, and one of the key pieces of this is that it's the patient's expectation that the clinicians give into sometimes. Right. So I wanted to know why the patient is expecting an antibiotic, even though there's been campaigns about resistance, there's been campaigns about not working for viruses. Why do they still come in and are not happy when they don't get an antibiotic, even when it's not appropriate?
Yeah. So my initial thought is that if you did a focus group interview on a group of patients who'd been given them and a group of patients who hadn't.
Okay.
That's another option, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a follow-up appointment, or you could invite them following a prescription event, or you might have access to them in terms of their respiratory clinic. Or the respiratory nurse, or something along those lines. And this is about thinking realistically about who you want to ask and what you want to ask them. And if you were looking at it from that perspective, are you looking at a ethnographic study? Had you thought at all about ethnography?
only when I looked at the original paper, as I said, where I looked at the prescribing in coastal regions. That obviously would be more of an ethnographic, but no, I hadn't got that far on this one. On the,
But
I was more focusing.
I think it would be worthwhile thinking about ethnography and an ethnographic question to ask, because it's lending itself a little bit, in my view, to that kind of study.
Okay, thank you.
So maybe do a little bit of reading about ethnography, if you can.
Okay, yeah.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to mute you again, Sarah, and I'm just going to go to Helen. Hi, Helen.
Hello.
Hello. You've sent me, yeah, about your mixed methods, positivist for the cause and effect and interpretive for the results. So, as I said yesterday, that's two different projects, isn't it? You sort of don't have time for both.
Okay.
So one of the things that you're going to need to decide and need to think through in the next period of time is which one you want to do. Because you don't have time for both.
Okay.
So you have to think to yourself, if I want to look at the cause and effect relationship, how am I going to develop an intervention evaluation study that's going to establish that causal link? And if I want to look at the results and see whether there was a benefit in terms of resilience and retention, then I'm looking at it from a different perspective, and I might be looking at it from certainly an interpretive phenomenological approach. So it's
interpretive phenomenology.
It's sort of like, what do you want to do? Because certainly from my perspective, I think to myself, I'm either one type of researcher or not. I would be a little bit bored developing an intervention evaluation because that's not my bag. But you might actually find that is you might find that an exciting methodology to follow. And so coming from a positivist perspective and looking at the principles behind positivist thinking in terms of your ontology and epistemology is a useful method for you. And this is what all of you do in a way. Do you get what I'm saying, Helen?
Yeah, so the sort of the cause and effect side of it would be the from a positivist aspect, but if we were to look at the benefit to the resilience and retention of staff due to an educational package, that's interpretive and phenomenological.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you don't, I'm not saying that both studies aren't equally valid and equally appropriate, but you're doing a master's, Helen. So one or the other, not both, because you just don't have time to. And this is one thing that this research proposal has got to be. It's got to be realistic, because even though I am looking at it from the perspective of an academic assignment, I am also looking to see whether it would stand up to a master's project, and that's what you're doing. And you've got to be realistic. Okay?
Okay, yeah, that's great.
I'm going to mute you again now. There we go. So, those of you who've been listening to that exchange, hopefully you've given yourself some thinking time to think, okay, what am I asking? What's my perspective? What's the approach going to be to this research question or statement? And from the very outset of your methodology, it needs to be explicit so that it is clear what you are doing and what approach you are taking. So all of you may have to do a little bit of reading around your different research approach. So if you've decided on, in Helen's case, if she decides to go down the positivist route, then that positivist background. If she decides to go down the IPA route, the interpretive phenomenological approach, then she needs to do some reading there. And equally, Sarah, if you decide to go down the ethnography route for your patient expectation study, then you'll need to do a little bit of work around the ethnography and ethnographic studies, and looking at the different types of ethnography and how you're going to undertake them, so that your methodological basis is sound and well supported. And the places to go for those reading material are any one of your research textbooks, whichever research textbook you've decided to use and utilise for this programme or programmes in the past. So whether it's your Pollitt and Hungler, Pollitt and Beck, all the different ones that I've cited, Parahu, whichever. So go to those as the basis, and then go to the journals and the Nurse Researcher and other journal articles and look for ethnographic themes or phenomenological themes across other people's literature, so that you can really get that rounded understanding of what this approach really means to you. Because from that, you develop your study design. So you have a section on your methodology, that philosophical underpinnings, and then it leads you to your research design. So what's your approach going to be? And this is where you focus on whether it's qualitative or quantitative, whether you're going to do a double-blind RCT, a longitudinal study, a cross-sectional study, and what your method of data collection is going to be. How are you going to undertake the actual results? So that the principles that you're going to undertake, whether you're going to interview, whether you're going to sample using a questionnaire and follow it up with a focus group, how you're going to design your studies. And I'm not suggesting that you have to use multiple methods of data collection, but those of you who decide to, then that will look like quite a robust study. You might also decide to use an approved, valid, reliable, robust tool that's already been used. Quality of life scores, dyspnea scores for respiratory patients, resilience and scores that have been used before. Using valid, previously utilised research tools is a perfectly acceptable mechanism. If you're going to use it, you might need permission to use it. So that is something you will look to for the next module. You can cite it in this module, but don't forget that you might need permission. So you might need to send an email to the source and get permission to use their tool or their set questionnaire or something. And these things are easy-ish to do, but sometimes they can be quite time-consuming. And there's a sort of chicken and egg situation sometimes here, because some people, particular tools can be downloaded from the internet and you can access them instantly. You don't need permissions. If you need permissions, sometimes they insist that you have ethics first, and then the ethics committee will say, do you have permission to use this tool? And that's where your supervisor can come in and assist you with that dialogue, which one has to come first and which one you need to undertake quickly and so on. So you've established how you're going to design your study, how you're going to build it. So in your research proposal, there might be a flowchart, there might be a diagram for a complicated intervention study, if that's what you're going to do. So you might want to draw a picture, that's absolutely fine. Text boxes, visual illustrations are perfectly acceptable in a research proposal. And then we need to look very carefully at your sampling and your sampling strategy. So you've told me what you want to find out. You've told me how you're going to ask them, and now you're going to tell me in detail who you're going to ask. So who's your sample going to be? And how you're going to access that sample and what your sampling strategy is going to be. Now that sampling strategy has to sit with that study design and that methodology. So using your example, Helen, about A&E staff nurses, your sample is A&E staff nurses. So you might say you only want to talk to qualified members of the emergency department. So that's your initial inclusion and exclusion criteria. are you going to put a parameter of the time that they've worked in the department? So are you going to talk to people who've been there for more than a year or less than a year, or more than 5 years, less than 5 years, or are you going to band your sample? You're going to put the results of the 1 to 5 years in one group and the 5 to 10 years in another group, if that's what you're looking at. How are you going to find these people? How are you going to get to them? Are you going to send them an invitation? Are you going to go into handover, for example, and give people information about the study and invite them to contact you? How are you going to access your sample? And what's your sampling strategy going to be? So if they reply to your invitation, is that going to be enough? Is that going to be convenient sampling? Or are you going to pick people on purpose because you know what they know and you want to speak to them because they've got a particular knowledge or insight into your particular area? So that might be purposive sampling. Or are you going to use theoretical sampling? So all of these principles need to be discussed. If you've used a positivist approach, how are you going to do stratified sampling across your sample? Is there going to be any randomization? Is there going to be any blind studies, any control groups, and so on? So again, you match your methodology with your method, with your sampling strategy. And so that follows the principles. You will then think about how many people you need, and the size of the sample that you require. If you are doing a qualitative study, how are you going to determine you've got enough information to make some analysis? Excuse me. If you are doing a positivist study, is your sample size going to be predetermined by the statistical test you've decided to use? So all of these things you've got to think about and outline in your research proposal. If you are coming at it from a qualitative perspective, we often talk about sample sizes being 10 to 15 or 15 to 20, and we allow that level of uncertainty because we talk about our sample size will be identified by theoretical saturation. Does anybody know what theoretical saturation is? And that'll be a no then, because nobody's put their hand up, nobody's written anything. Yeah, in a way, one of the answers has come through. So theoretical saturation is where you have collected data and no new information is resulting. So one of the answers was absolutely correct. So for example, if you are doing a focus group interview and you've done 2 focus groups and you've analysed those 2 focus groups and they were both different, you might want to do a third focus group interview. So you do your third focus group interview and no new themes, no new pieces of information become evident from that third one. You can then say that following the third focus group interview, you had achieved theoretical saturation. And in terms of your research proposal, you can say that I will do 2 initial focus group interviews and then establish whether more are required if theoretical saturation has not been achieved. And you can leave it like that, and there are many research references that will support that discussion. If you are doing interviews, again, you might do 6 interviews, analyse the data, say, okay, I've got a number of themes that are still coming out from the interviews, I need to do a couple more. So you do a couple more and it becomes evident that you have reached theoretical saturation or you haven't. So the same principle exists in interviewing. So if you are using focus group interviews or interviews, you would suggest that you need to achieve theoretical saturation, and that will identify your sample size. If, on the other hand, you are coming at it from a positivist perspective and you have decided that you are going to look for a cause and effect, as in one example that Helen cited earlier, that sample size will be predetermined by whichever statistical test you are going to use for your analysis. So if you are looking for cause and effect, you may want to use some sort of simple probability scoring for your results. And so you would input the information into a statistical package, and it would say to you, you need X number for your sample to achieve statistical significance. You need 40, you need whatever. So your sample size in that study would be predetermined by the statistical test that you've chosen. So that's why I go back to that earlier comment I made, that if you have got the aims and objectives right, then all the rest falls into place. Because if you're going to ask those questions in that way, this is the method of data collection that you're going to require, this is going to be the sampling strategy you're going to require, and so on. And so in terms of your research proposal, it falls into place. So you make that determination at the beginning, and then what I'm looking for when I'm marking this assignment in terms of the academic requirement is that the process matches, that I can clearly identify from objective number one, that you're going to do the questionnaire, and that will answer that objective, and that objective will be answered in that way. And then objective number 2 is going to be addressed here, and objective number 3 is going to be addressed here, and this is how I'm going to analyse it, so that the process matches. There's no point in talking, if you tell me at the beginning that you want to do something and then the process doesn't match. It's like saying at the beginning that you're going to make a pavlova and then you start talking about making a chocolate cake. That's a very simplistic example, but that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So you indicate the size of your sample, the scope, the field work maybe if you require it. So if you're doing an ethnographic study, is there going to be any field work involved? And then what I would like in your research proposal is some sort of timing, some sort of indication that you've thought about how long this process is going to take. And this is where, obviously, I'm not going to get you to stick to this rigidly, but if you look at it over the period of the year, so imagine you are undertaking this project next year for your master's, when you're going to do bits and how long it's going to take you. So that when I look at this project, I go, yeah, she's really clearly identified what she needs to do, who she needs to ask, and how long that's going to take. Any questions on that bit? Fab. Okay, so we've done research design, and we've covered this in a little bit of detail as well. So then we talk in that research design section, we talk about our methods. So where are we going? Where's the study going to be located? How are the subjects going to be chosen? What instruments? And your appendices will have to include an example of the study's proposed methods of data collection. So if you're going to use a questionnaire, an example of your questionnaire. If you're going to use observational scoring, how you're going to do it. If you're going to use some sort of interview, semi-structured interview, an outline of the kind of questions that you're going to ask. And I'm going to look at those questions and then we're going to go, do they match your research objectives? So are you asking the questions I'm expecting you to ask? You might consider doing some pilot work. If you're going to use a questionnaire, are you going to test it with a small group of people to see if you're getting the correct information? If you are doing an interview, you're going to do one trial interview to ensure that you've got the data. So some indication that you are going to test your instrument prior to the start of the full study. I'm not expecting that you do a full piece of pilot work because you don't have time. but you might want to think about, as soon as you've got ethical clearance, thinking about doing one focus group or one interview quickly to ensure that your tool is valid. And that's maybe all you need to state, that you've given that idea some thought and that you need to test the instruments that you're using. You might also, if you're using an approved tool, you might say pilot work is unnecessary because I'm using an approved tool. So you clearly indicated that you've given it the correct amount of thought. So just going back slightly, it says describe your methods of data collection. So we've already identified that we're going to discuss and outline exactly how you are going to collect the data, and examples of that will fall in your appendix. So when it comes to it, when you decide what method of data collection you're going to use, if, for example, you decide to use a questionnaire, there's loads of extremely useful help online about designing a questionnaire. So you don't need to start from scratch. There are websites that I can direct you to that will help you with questionnaire design, for example. If you decide to use an interview, there are some techniques that you might want to think about equally. If you're going to use an observational schedule, there are some guidelines in certain particular research sources that highlight exactly what you've got to think about when you're doing observational data. So once you've made that decision, ask me for some additional assistance, because there is a lot of additional assistance out there. You might find it on your own, but if you have any problems, don't hesitate to ask me. And so that you can outline exactly what your method of data collection is going to be. You've then got to talk about how you are going to analyse this data. Obviously, you haven't got any data yet, so you're not analysing it. You are suggesting how you would analyse it. So, if you are coming from a quantitative perspective, you might discuss what statistical test you're going to use and why, and how that statistical test is going to answer your original research objective. So you might want to use a probability scoring, a chi-square score, a Mann-Whitney test, whatever that statistical tool is, you might decide to use. And then if you are coming from a qualitative perspective, you might be undertaking constant comparative analysis, which is CCA. You might be using content analysis. You might be using a thematic analysis, a little bit like we did when we were looking at the literature. So if you have a number of interview transcripts that have been, you've recorded your interviews, you've had them transcribed into written source, and you might look through them for themes. That would be your thematic analysis. Because the idea here is that you need to convince the reader that your analysis will deliver what your objectives were. So how are you going to ensure that you are going to do what you said you were going to do at the beginning? So convince me that the research proposal is going to stand up. You're then going to need to talk about, so that's your analysis section, and then you go on to talk about ethics. Access and ethics is really important. So this is where you're going to just, going back a little bit over some of the work that you might have done on sampling, but how are you going to access your subjects? How are you going to ensure that clinical governance requirements and ethical approval will be sought? So all of you, as I stated at the beginning, you're going to have to go through the University Ethics Committee. The University Ethics Committee is there for academic purposes. All of you might additionally need to go through, as I said, additional ethics clearance in your local area. You are going to need to outline in your research proposal how this is going to be undertaken and what ethical clearance is going to be required. So you are going to need to find out personally, and every single section on this will be different for all of you, what ethical approval you will require. So you can all say that you need university, and then there'll need to be a second bit about what other ethical clearance that you require. Also, you're going to cite in this particular section all the additional information that you're going to give your research respondents. So if, for example, you are sending them a questionnaire, is it going to be accompanied with an information sheet, and then develop an information sheet? If you are interviewing somebody, you might need to develop a brief consent form because they might need to consent to their interview. And again, I can help you with documents, and the National Patient Safety Agency website and other websites are really useful in helping you develop consent forms and information sheets. Equally, the Research Ethics Committee here at the university is very helpful in sending you in the right road for those pieces of information. So you might want to describe how your role and what your role is going to do, and how you're going to manage that situation. So for example, if you are asking staff members about their processes and practice, what you are going to do about your relationship within that organisation, and how you are going to manage any kind of clinical governance issues or reporting requirements. I cite, for example, I did a piece of research a few years ago about newly qualified staff nurses, and I was a senior nurse in the organisation at the time. So the Ethics Committee were very clear that the research information I collected couldn't be used in any kind of disciplinary or performance development review purposes. Now that poses ethical issues, doesn't it? And professional issues. So if I'm listening to an interview as a researcher and the staff nurse is outlining practice that I consider to be dangerous or unsafe or unprofessional, what do I do as a researcher? Any suggestions? Okay, yeah, that's one suggestion. So you can get somebody else to do the interviews for you, and you simply review the transcripts. But even by reviewing the transcripts, you will have that information. So what will you do about it? And the Ethics Committee, in my particular case, were very clear that if I collected any information that was considered to be an issue of patient safety, then I had to, at the end of the interview, ask the respondent to repeat some of the information that they'd given me to another member of staff. Now, of course, if that particular staff member then refused and said, no, I'm not going to tell that story again, I was in a very difficult position. Now, fortunately, that didn't happen, although I did, when listening to one of the interviews, come across some slightly disturbing information. When I asked the particular respondent if they could repeat the story to me, and a senior member of staff, they did, and we worked through why it was problematic, and there was a intervention put in place, and there was some additional support to this newly qualified staff nurse put in place to support them in future situations, because it was felt that they didn't have adequate knowledge or skill to manage them. But I don't know quite what I would have done if they hadn't agreed to repeat the story. But what I couldn't do, because the Ethics Committee had made it very clear to me that I couldn't, is I couldn't take that information independently to senior members of staff without the respondent's permission. So if you are researching your colleagues or researching your teams or researching other practitioners, what are you going to do? And equally, what are you going to do when you hear patients give you information that you might want to take outside the research environment? So you have to think about that situation in your ethics. and your supervisor will help you with this section, and as will the Research Ethics Committee. Any questions on that? That's a good question. Your research supervisor needs to be somebody from the university. That does mean that you can access somebody who might have a joint appointment, so somebody who has an honorary contract within the university as well as being in the workplace. Often when we are undertaking master's research, you have a practice supporter or co-supervisor, but your key supervisor needs to be a member of academic staff for your master's project. Have all of you given that question some thought, your supervisor? Okay, so if you haven't given that any thought at all, then you need to start thinking about who you might like. And I can help you with people who are able and keen and so on. You might, one of the key things to think about in terms of your academic supervisor is it doesn't matter necessarily if they don't have the same clinical background as you. In terms of your research proposal, it's about their approach. So you need somebody who's got a good working knowledge of your methodology and your methodological approach. And I can help you with that, but the sooner you identify somebody and maybe start a conversation, they don't have to do anything until next year, and they don't have anything to do with this particular module as per se, but it is often useful to identify that person over the next couple of months and think, right, okay, this is their background, I need to start a dialogue. So that when we start the project in September, you have that working relationship already established and they can help you guide. I don't have an actual physical list. If you, once Tuesday's over with and we've got some idea of research approaches, and if you're not coming on Tuesday, then maybe by the end of the module, if you can give me a brief statement, and then I can help you with some names. So, and then it's about you asking specific people. I can tell you if the names that I will supply you with are people that are workloaded and expecting to supervise master's students in the next academic year. So, and I don't have that information as yet, and I will have it soon. So I can help you with identifying the supervisor. So your final section of the research proposal then is your dissemination and recommendations. It's like the conclusion of your piece of work. This is where you can describe in concrete terms what the study will deliver and what you're going to do with it once you've finished it. So it's not acceptable and it's not really ethical to do research for research's sake. So this is where you outline exactly what the purpose of this piece of research is. So is it because you want to prove that something works? Is it that you want to prove the benefit of something? Is it that you want to establish that there is investigation required or further development required? So this section tends to be a concluding statement, but equally it's recommendations for either further education, further practice or further research, often further research, because you're never going to answer all questions. Any research finishes with further research being required. It's important that you establish that what the benefit might be. So whether that's a benefit to your work, your patient, your society, or well-being generally, it's important that you establish that there is a potential benefit to undertaking this piece of research, and what that benefit might be. So that's the end of the formal presentation. Do you have any questions for me? Either put your hand up, open your mics, or type something up. I'll give you a few minutes. Okay, so no questions. One of the other supplementary pieces of material Sue, shall I open your mic? There we go. Sue, hi.
It was me, Shirley.
Oh, Shirley, hi. Shirley with Sue.
Shirley with Sue, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the question, I was trying to sort of think how to word it really, but I'm aiming to do all about hospital prevention. I came from a community matron background, so I was doing case management then. Now I'm working in a GP surgery, and I'd like to sort of compare how it could work from a GP surgery point of view, about giving sort of complex patients a bit more proactive care. And I was thinking possibly doing a comparison between a group of patients that got some proactive care and those that didn't, and then looking at their outcomes. But I wasn't quite sure if that was ethically.
Yeah, one of the first questions I would ask is about ethics, because one would suggest anybody with a preventative policy in place, or some preventative management practice, and then establishing a group that don't have that, would it be ethical not to have those two groups?
Yeah, that's what we just debated here, and I wasn't quite sure. It was my sort of a thought of how I could sort of prove that it could work. But you're not giving the care to a certain group of people.
Yeah, that's always that's always that humdinger thing of ethics, isn't it?
Yeah.
I suppose one of the questions I would ask is: do you need to have that comparison group if you go at it from a slightly different perspective? So think about your research approach and think about whether you need to establish proof of anything. Can you identify either from historical records that there is a generic improvement in patient outcomes? So if you did some sort of case study analysis of prior to the intervention, put the intervention in place, and then looked at patient outcomes following it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do, yeah. With before and after sort of comparison.
Yes. So looking at it, so you might say, over the past year, I noticed that you've been into hospital 4 times, for example.
Yeah.
We've now put this treatment evaluation in, we've put this treatment in place, you're not going into hospital. Why is that? Yeah?
Yeah.
And so instead of doing it from I'm proving that this is better for these groups of patients, I can establish an improvement in outcome for this particular patient. Because we have to be realistic.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so think through whether that might be a useful mechanism. So look at some of the philosophical approaches around case study analysis, or looking at it from a patient narrative approach, so looking at it from a phenomenological approach. Yeah?
Okay.
So thinking about it that way instead of a comparison group, because that's looking at it from a very positivist issue, and it might be something that you say that a positivist approach isn't appropriate because you can't ethically withhold treatment from a group of people.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay?
Yeah. I think so.
Thanks, Shirley. Yes, Helen, the bulk of the marks, i.e. 55 marks, 55%, goes in that methodology study design section. There's a lot of work to do in that section. You've got 10 marks going to the, hopefully my maths is correct, you've got 10 marks going to the ethics, you've got 10 marks going to the conclusion. Is that right? I'll have to quickly, I'll go and check how I've allocated them. But yes, 55% is on that study design section. You've got 5 marks for the introduction, you've got 20 marks for the literature review, 55% to the philosophical, the aims, methodology, method and analysis. You've got 10 going to ethics and 10 going to that final recommendations for practice, etc. section. So that's, is that my maths right? 20, 75, yeah, that's right. Just checking. Okay, so thank you very much. Rebecca, hi there.
Hi there.
Hi. So you're looking...
I've just been thinking about the proposal,
Yeah,
and in terms of ethics, obviously I'm looking at the social processes between working colleagues,
yeah,
and obviously I'm moving into a new role shortly and want to use that information from there, but then I'm concerned about building relationships with obviously my colleagues and gaining data, or should I just use sort of interviews and questionnaires from other practices? I mean, there is an element of bias in there because I will be working in that area,
yeah.
or directly involved. Should I just keep that out, or?
Well, I suppose you have to ask yourselves a number of questions. Firstly, if you look at it from one perspective, your relationship is influential in the research. So if you looked at it from an interpretive phenomenological approach, for example, immersing yourself in the data is wholly appropriate.
Yeah.
If, on the other hand, you want to look at it from an ethnographic perspective and look at it in terms of is it the role and the role socialization, etc., the environment that influences behaviour, then it might be worth thinking about doing that study in other settings, and then you can make some comparative discussion about your own setting. So you need to think through where you want to come from as a researcher. That's why, again, I go back to that comment about your ontology and your epistemology. You need to know where you are in the research. Because otherwise you either contaminate it. So if you say, I'm going to be ethnographic, but I actually work here, is that possible? Is that fluid?
I was thinking more of an interpretive approach because, it will show development of the new role.
Right. And what sort of data collection? Were you thinking of interviewing people, or were you thinking of observational data, or what were you thinking?
Interviewing and questionnaires, really.
Okay.
I hadn't really got that far, but interviewing definitely.
Okay, so it sounds like you are coming at it from a slightly more sort of phenomenological perspective. So maybe have a think in the next few days, Rebecca, about how how phenomenology works and what we mean by that, to see if that sits well with what you're thinking. And then I think it would be fine to be in that team relationship, but you might have to think very carefully about who you interview.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah. Okay then.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I've muted you again. So I'm just going to look at this additional piece of information that I put on the writing the research proposal, which is, if we look at is this document. It's a very simple document that I've put up that just outlines in a way your headings and what we expect to be in the presentation. So I expect there to be an abstract. So I will expect there to be a synopsis of your research proposal outlined in your submission. It's not included in your word count, but it should be there. You will have to provide an abstract when you submit it for an ethics committee. So it's an important skill to be able to do, and it's the very last thing you write, because it's a sort of, as you've seen with many of the abstracts that you've read on articles that you've been looking at, they always provide an abstract. So it's like your movie trailer, as it were. You then come into your introduction, which we've discussed. And this is what sits within your word count, is the introduction onwards. So introduction, your literature review, your aims and objectives, your methodology section, your methods section, study design, sampling, access, your ethics section, and your analysis. Now, in this particular list, I've put ethics before analysis. I don't mind in which order you put it. It just needs to be there. In the presentation, I put analysis before ethics. I don't mind which one goes in which order, but they both need to be there. Sometimes I feel that ethics flows better before analysis, but it's up to you. Then your recommendations and your conclusions, which in terms of the marking criteria is one section, but you can divide it into two if that works better for you. Obviously your references, they're not included in your word count, and your appendices. Appendices form a very important part of your research proposal. They are absolutely essential. You cannot submit a research proposal without appendices. I would expect there to be a number of appendices. Firstly, you're going to have your search grid. That will be Appendix 1. So your search strategy for your literature review. Appendix 2 may well be literature summaries if you choose to use that tool to assist you in the presentation of your research. So those are the two appendices that will be linked to your literature review section. Following that, you will have appendices that support your methods section. So if you are using a statistical test, what it is. If you're using a method of data collection such as an interview schedule. If you're using a questionnaire, an example of your questionnaire. If you are using a tried and tested tool of data collection, it will be cited in your appendix. Then we come to sampling, then we come to access, then we come to ethics. In your ethics section will need to be supported by an information sheet, a consent form if necessary, and so on. So each of your specific sections will have appendices that are associated. So there will have to be appendices to this assignment. One note of caution is, of course, when you submit this as a document, remember that you can only submit one Word document in your electronic submission. So you need to, at some point prior to submission, save it as a single document. You cannot load on the DLE at present multiple Words documents. So my advice to you would be, once you have finished it and you've got the whole thing set, save it as a PDF. And if you submit it as a PDF, it formatting won't change. It won't change at all in terms of your whole holistic assignment from abstract through to the end of your appendices. So I would advise you, if you can, submit it as a PDF or submit it as one single Word document, which is going to mean that you have to cut and paste it into a single saved document at some point. So, any questions on that? Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop recording now.